platform where we connect Islamabad to Washington. All eyes were set on Washington this past week as the two war on terror allies met to iron out their differences. Although both sides termed the dialogue as progressive, successful, but the truth and this general sentiment is quite the contrary. And this is exactly the focus of our debate tonight. With me in my studios in Islamabad is Mr. Mushahid Hussain. Mr. Mushahid Hussain is the Secretary General of the Pakistan Muslim League Qaid. Thank you for joining us, Mushahid Saab. And now let's cross over to my colleague Raza Naqvi in the Washington studios. Raza, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and welcome viewers to Voice of America's Washington studios. I'm your host, Raza Naqvi. To discuss the third round of the strategic dialogue process that took place just last week here in Washington, D.C., we have Ambassador Bill Milam, who is a former ambassador to Pakistan and a senior policy analyst at the Woodrow Wilson Institute. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us. But actually, I want to begin in Islamabad, and I want to begin by asking your guest over there, Maria. The dialogue here concluded on what seemed to be a pretty positive note. Everyone seemed to go home pretty happy with what had come out. But what I want to ask is what the perception was in Pakistan. What did the media there, what did the civil society there feel that came out of this latest round of the strategic dialogue?
Right. Now, Mushahid Saab, my colleague wants to ask you, the general perception, as I mentioned, was that both sides are saying all was good, we achieved a lot, we did a lot, and there was some sort of a breakthrough. Your comments on that?
Well, good afternoon to our friends in Washington, especially Ambassador Milam, who has served in Pakistan with distinction, and he's a good friend of Pakistan and the region, and also to Mr. Raza Naqvi. It's also a pleasure to be talking to you on this program. I would say that there was a lot of good atmospherics. The optics were good. The form was good. They met President Barack Hussain Obama also. Hillary Clinton made the right kind of noises. They talked of promises for the future. But for the present, what we feel from the Pakistani side, and this is a widespread perception, that nothing tangible or concrete was really the outcome. For instance, I mean, the reconstruction opportunity zones, coalition support fund arrears, focus on Kashmir, US-Pakistan nuclear civil deal, and so there's a whole checklist of issues, drone attacks. So what was the outcome? And even for the future, $2 billion is operative from 2012. Absolutely. And there will be a lot of provisos and caveats. And don't forget, on 2nd of November, the US is having midterm elections, and that could perhaps even politically weaken Mr. Obama further.
Right. Now, let's cross over to Washington. And Raza, I'd like to ask Ambassador Milam the same question. What is his perception on this dialogue process? Does he term it as successful? What does he see?
Right, Ambassador Milam, that's Maria's question. I want to add a little caveat to that. Mr. Mushahid Hussain mentioned that nothing concrete really came out of it. Was that the objective of these talks? Was that the objective, to get something concrete on the table out for the public to see?
Well, I don't know if it was or not. I think the objective in a larger sense is to build a relationship of trust and mutual confidence in each other. And these strategic dialogue meetings are, I think, working towards that in a good way. I thought the outcome in the atmospheric sense, as Mushahid said, was very positive. And it's hard to say that anything concrete came out of it unless you think of atmospherics as also made of some concrete or building towards concrete.
Well, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, you're a career diplomat. How important are the atmospherics?
Very important. Very important indeed. I think our relationship in the past was characterized by a lot of bad atmospherics and mutual mistrust, and to the extent that the strategic dialogue is moving us off of that and towards a much more trustful relationship, I think it's all to the good.
Right. I want to take that question back to Islamabad, to Mr. Mushahid Hussain. The atmospherics you mentioned was really the most positive thing to come out of this. But we saw prior to this dialogue, this third round of dialogue, that there was a lot of things flying around. We had the NATO incursions into Pakistan. We had the NATO supply lines cut off. We had, statements coming out of top administration officials in the U.S. saying that Pakistan needs to do more in terms of going after militants. I mean, there was a lot that was, that laid the groundwork for what could have been a positive dialogue. Do you think that is a concrete thing that came out of this?
Yes, you should not forget also that in the run-up to the dialogue, and you mentioned a couple of other events, let me add a couple of others. There was this White House report to the US Congress on Pakistan, which was not very, I would say, complimentary towards Pakistan, because it was laced with a lot of suspicion about Pakistan's role, our motives, particularly regarding the armed forces and the security forces. And secondly, also, there was this escalation of the Afghan war, the drone attacks, and the highest number of drone attacks took place in September in the last 4 or 5 years, and that's about 16, I think, in that month.
23, sir.
23. So you can see that it's all, the average was very high. And so, despite the atmospherics, and that was a positive, I would say, and also I think the tone was different of President Obama and Hillary Clinton vis-a-vis their predecessor administration, because they speak with empathy and a certain amount of respect for Pakistan, which is very important, because Pakistani people have a lot of pride on that one.
Right, but do you think that it's the same game with just the actors perhaps changing and the tone changing? Do you think basically the motives are the same as compared to the predecessors?
I also see a lot of confusion emanating out of Washington, D.C. And I think the confusion has been also documented in a recent, very interesting book I read of Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars, where the White House, the politicos, are going in a different direction. They don't have a stomach for a sustained war. It's very clear. They want Biden, Obama, his national security team. And on the other hand, the military crowd, the Defense Secretary, Mr. Gates, Admiral Mullen, General Petraeus, they are the ones who are saying, okay, let's hammer the Taliban, let's go for the Taliban, and they have the military option. So I think that there is a dichotomy in US policy between the civil side and the military side, and there's a lot of confusion, and that confusion is also reflected in the US-Pakistan policy.
So hold that thought. Let's go back to Washington. Raza, I'd like to ask Ambassador Milam, talking about this confusion, this has been really talked about in the media quite a lot, that Washington's policy is not very clear. On one hand, it's advocating dialogue with the Taliban, and on the other, it's talking about a military option. We saw the NATO-sponsored dialogue between the Taliban and the Karzai-led government, in which Pakistan, of course, was not included, as one of these prime examples.
Go ahead. I mean, does there seem to be a sort of contradiction in policy coming out of D.C.? I
wouldn't say it's a contradiction, but there is an element of confusion in our policy approach these days, and it is because of the domestic political consequences of continuing a war.